So in Chapter 8, Lesson 1, we talked about how we had this new normalcy that we were going to be looking at in the presidencies of Calvin Coolidge and Warren G. Harding. And I want to talk about what that looks like in more detail, because I know we had mentioned things like supply-side economics, but we didn't actually kind of talk about what that looked like in the real cultural identity of America as more and more people started going to work, and how America changes because of this push in the 1920s for supply-side economics. So I want to start by saying that the way in which we work as Americans actually undergoes a pretty significant change, believe it or not, when it comes to our cultural identity. We're going to see Americans working shorter days, shorter weeks, and being paid more even as prices fall. In the 1920s, as Americans are actually engaging in this kind of industrial work after World War I, this is actually the beginning of kind of a widespread middle class that we're all used to as Americans today. And the reason that happens is actually due to what we consider a revolution in mass production. Now, we discussed mass production way back in Chapter 3. We said that when a company is able to reach an economy of scale, it's able to produce so many goods at such a small price that it can become a really large corporation. But mass production in the 1920s, 1920s, actually looks a little bit different thanks to one of the inventions made by Henry Ford, which is the assembly line. Now, understand this. The assembly line has certainly been used before, but in the assembly line, it used to be different. You used to have a thing that would sit, and people would do work on that thing, and the people would move from one thing to the next thing, to the next thing, to the next thing, down the line. That actually took up more time than was needed. It wasn't as efficient. So Henry Ford switches that concept, and instead, he takes the thing and he moves the thing down the line. And the worker just stays there. So now we have workers who are responsible for just one or two things as the car moves by the person. The person never has to move. Totally can cut down the amount of time needed to produce a car, because the only thing that holds people back, besides funny-looking moose antlers when making a car now for Henry Ford, is how fast you can do that one thing before the car moves past you. Henry Ford's focus is on making sure all unnecessary movement is at a very, very minimum. Everything is timed. And he begins to experiment with this concept. He says, okay, we're gonna time your bathroom breaks. We're gonna time the distance between the assembly line and the bathroom. We're gonna time how long it takes for you to get from the assembly line to your lunch line, from the lunch line back to the assembly line. How long does it take you to pick up your tools and do your work and put your tools down again? Everything is on the clock. It's all timed to a science so that he can produce as many of his cars as possible. And he does this again and again and again. He's got a lot of different cars, Model A, Model B, Model C, Model D, and it goes on and on and on and on and on. But it's not until he gets to the Model T, also known as the Tin Lizzie or Flivver, that he's actually able to produce a car incredibly efficiently so that the price drops. So that by 1925, one of these cars is being made every 10 seconds. So I've been talking now for 3 minutes and 55 seconds. That's a lot of cars that have come off the line. 20 plus cars have already come off the line. Now it's 4 minutes. You know, what is that? That's 6 times 4. That's 24 cars have already been produced. Higher the supply of cars that Henry Ford can make, for example, the lower the price, which means Ford will sell far more. Now, I know that here it says that he sells far more and he can raise his workers' pay, and that's definitely part of it. But that's not actually why Henry Ford raises his workers' pay. He actually dramatically increases their wage. Let's say let's say that the people who were working for Chevrolet could have got $2.25. At Henry Ford's plant, you got $5 an hour. The reason Henry Ford did that was that he actually discovered that if he paid his people too little, they had no incentive to stay and work for him. So they would quit and just walk off and go find a new job, which would totally stop the production line, slow down his assembly line, make it less efficient, keep himself from making more cars, kept the price from falling. Henry Ford realized by giving people $5 an hour, which was way over minimum wage. It wasn't even a minimum wage. It was way over what anyone else was paying. By giving him $5 an hour, people would stay with him. They would learn their job, and they wouldn't quit. Now, they actually had a whole series of things they had to do to keep their job. They had to learn English, so if you were an immigrant, you were forced to learn English. Your home could be inspected by Henry Ford's people to make sure you were living a healthy and clean and productive lifestyle. You had to act the way he wanted you to act. You couldn't drink, for example, so that you would show up to work, you would be sober. He had a high standard for his employees, and if you didn't meet it, out the door you went. So that $5 an hour came with some pretty big strings attached to it, but it did allow him to keep workers really for a really long time and make them productive. Just give you one last example before we move on. Henry Ford, at one point, before 1920, hired 52,000 people in 1 year, but he only needed 14,000 to actually work his assembly line. That's how many people would start the job, quit, walk off the job. That's a lot of new people to train. By making that wage $5 an hour, by making people stay sober, by making people stay healthy living, by keeping them working for him, by giving them that $5 an hour, he cut down that turnover dramatically. End result, work week shortens, work day shortens, higher pay, prices of goods are going to fall, and especially when it comes to things like the car and other groundbreaking and game-changing technologies. Henry Ford's not the only person that's going to realize this is the way to keep his workers by paying them a higher wage. Remember, that was part of supply-side economics. As long as you're paying people a higher wage, they're going to continue to work for you and continue to spend more money. Many other companies realize it too, and that's going to actually begin to result in some pretty intense changes to American cultural society, because as people end up earning more and more money, people actually begin to realize that they can pay off their debt over time. So that before you'd have such small amounts of money, you didn't buy things unless you actually had the cash. With the increased pay, Americans begin to think to themselves, they're saying, hey, wait a minute. I think I can buy that computer or that couch or that car. I think I can do that over time. I don't think I need to have all the cash up front. I can pay a little every month. That's called credit, and it's one of the dramatic ways our culture changes over time, because between 1900 and 1920, America sees a real explosion of loans being offered to average everyday Americans, who then use those loans to actually go out and buy things they don't need, but things that they want. This is a really important concept, because it's not until the 1920s that you really have large numbers of Americans buying things that they actually just want, not things that they need. Things like razors and tissues and irons and all other kinds of consumer comfort goods that they don't really need. And it's all because of the emergence of credit. Credit is what helps these people buy cars or radios. I mean, what we end up seeing here is a huge consumer society. Wait for it. A huge consumer society, which means more and more Americans are going to be buying these goods on, as it says right here, credit. Two examples of this, some of the earliest things that begin to happen in the 1900s, you're going to see oil companies and diner club companies and even credit card companies like American Express, all in the 1900s to 1940, they begin to develop and they begin to expand. And department stores offer their own credit cards. Sears offers their own credit cards. Montgomery Ward offers their own credit cards. All these different places begin to offer their own charge cards or credit cards to continue to encourage people to buy, to consume. Remember, that's supply-side economics, right? The more you consume, the better companies do, the more they can pay you. The more you end up making, the more you can consume, and around it goes, right? As long as we're buying, our economy is going to be great in the 1920s. Most things that are big payment purchases in the 1920s are bought on credit. 75% of radios, 60% of cars, all are bought on credit. So you're going to see all kinds of companies emerge, whether they're car companies or radio companies, broadcasting companies, acting companies, all these kinds of things are put out there into our society, and it changes who we are, because now it doesn't matter if you're in Sheboygan, I think that's Wisconsin or maybe Michigan, I don't know, whether you're in Topeka, which is Kansas, whether you're in Albuquerque down in New Mexico, whether you're in Tallahassee, which is in Florida, you can get the same access to information. America's culture begins for the first time to start to knit itself together. We're starting to get a national culture, one broadcast, one set of news, one kind of message reaching the people, not as localized, northeast, south, northeast, midwest, Rocky Mountain, Great Plains. We're starting to see more of a kind of United States concept of embracing and understanding the news. That's a big change. And a lot of it is thanks to credit. Now, I don't want you to get the wrong idea, though. I mean, yeah, credit was great for a lot of people. The middle class of America really did well with that. But not everyone's going to get access to those higher wage jobs that you see coming out of mass production assembly lines, or not everyone's going to get access to that credit, which is going to let them buy all those consumer goods. The bottom line here for a lot of folks is that the poor are going to end up getting poorer during the 1920s in that return to normalcy. Laissez-faire, remember we talked about this during the Gilded Age, didn't necessarily result in high wages for a lot of people. That problem is going to endure in the 1920s when laissez-faire comes back. So you're going to see people kind of dealing with this issue of uneven prosperity. Four main groups are really going to have a tough time. We're going to break this down as we look at this over the next several lessons. Remember, we're going to see a ton of African Americans lose those World War I factory jobs. That's going to create high unemployment for African Americans as they're kicked out, Great Migration or not, and whites move back into those jobs as they come out of World War I. We know that creates all kinds of unrest for folks. Native Americans are going to really be hurt because they're isolated on reservations that are out in the middle of nowhere. Remember, even for African Americans who came into the Great Migration, they moved from the South, these rural areas where they sharecropped, up into northern cities. Those northern cities, Chicago, Minneapolis, St. Paul, Columbus, Pittsburgh, Rochester, Buffalo, all these kinds of northern cities, there's no Native American reservations near there, especially out in the Midwest, the Great Plains, the Rockies. A lot of empty land out there, no urban areas, no industry. Native Americans aren't going to get the work. They're not going to enter the middle class like most white Americans will. Immigrants are going to be a target. We're going to continue to see this being a pattern. As laissez-faire returns, people worry about competition for those jobs, especially in the early 1920s when things were bad, taking a look at the fear that people are going to have over the arrival of immigrants, over the revolutions that are happening in Europe, worried that could happen here in America. Immigrants are going to be targeted. We're going to focus more on that coming up in another lesson. Farmers suffer, and that's going to come from the fact that there's going to be increased demand, increased production thanks to all these revolutions in technology like tractors and everything else that they're going to see, harvesters really helping them produce more. But at the same time, we're going to see a drop-off in demand because we're going to see a shrinking or a slowing of immigration. So as we slow immigration, right? We don't want as many immigrants. We're not going to have as much demand for some of these food or goods that you don't have to buy on credit, like food, right? Food, that's not something you often buy on credit. So less demand, higher production, that's going to mean really, really low prices. Remember, as supply rises, price falls, right? So we see supply rising, price falling, right? So here you go, right? Supply, price, whoop. As supply rises, price falls. That's really going to hurt farmers. To try and help them, one of the things that Congress actually does is pass a tariff. It's called the Fordney-McComber Act of 1922. Nice idea, right? The idea here is that we put a tariff on these European farm products coming in. People will buy American. It should raise the price of those crops that Americans are producing. But what we didn't count on were the Europeans putting tariffs on our goods as well. That tariff war that it creates means that our farmers are no longer going to be able to sell overseas to Europeans, so that they actually end up closing that market, making it harder for our farmers to get ahead. Higher production, less demand, low prices. The McComber tariff doesn't help with that at all. The McComber tariff actually makes it harder to sell overseas. It's a tough time for farmers. So there's just a kind of a quick update on some of the social changes, some of the economic, I want to say, impact of kind of this return to laissez-faire, and some of the people that it gets left out, and some of the ways that it changes our culture.